Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ever feel like your brain has a mind of its own when you're trying to make a decision?
Yeah, absolutely.
Today we're diving into the fascinating realm of cognitive biases, those unconscious shortcuts our brains take that can, lead us down some surprisingly biased paths.
Exactly. These biases are sort of hardwired into how we process information. Think of them as mental filters, They can skew how we see the world and the choices we make, often without us even realizing they're there.
Right. And in this deep dive, we're going to unpack three of the really influential ones: confirmation bias, negative bias, and status quo bias.
Yeah, those are big ones.
We'll explore how these play out when the stakes are sky high versus when they're, relatively low.
And how they impact the world of business and leadership, too.
Absolutely. And most importantly, what the research actually tells us about how we can maybe push back against these ingrained tendencies.
Offering some solutions.
Our goal is pretty simple.
Yeah.
To give you some practical knowledge to help you make sharper, hopefully less biased decisions. Okay, let's start with confirmation bias. What's the core idea there?
Okay. So at its heart, confirmation bias is our natural inclination to seek out, interpret, favor, and even recall information that just lines up with what we already believe. It's like we subconsciously build a case for what we already think is true.
Right. So we tend to gravitate towards news outlets or maybe people who echo our own opinions.
Yeah.
And we might unintentionally just brush aside information that challenges our viewpoints.
Definitely. And it's not just about what we seek out. It's also about how we interpret things. If information is ambiguous, confirmation bias suggests we're, more likely to twist it to fit our existing beliefs.
That makes sense. And the online world seems like perfect ground for this, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's fertile ground. Research has shown that in virtual teams, for example, members often focus on and prioritize information that confirms their initial ideas. And this can really limit a team's ability to see the full picture, to consider innovative alternatives.
Yeah, I can see that. If you're convinced your approach is the right one, you're naturally going to be more receptive to data that seems to support it. And maybe less critical of any potential weaknesses. And It's not just in professional settings, right? It affects our everyday online experiences too.
Totally. Studies looking at online shopping behavior have found that customers tend to prefer and trust reviews that confirm their initial opinion about a product.
Okay.
So if you already think a certain brand is reliable, you'll likely give more weight to positive reviews you read about it.
It's almost like we're just looking for validation.
Yeah, kind of. And this tendency seems to be stronger when we feel more certain about our beliefs and think we already know a lot about a topic. Precisely. Yeah. The strength of our convictions and our perceived knowledge are significant drivers of confirmation bias. Interestingly, this bias has even been linked to things like investors underperforming the market. They call it the return gap.
Really? How does that work?
Well, it can happen because overconfident investors might stubbornly stick with their initial assessments, right? Even when the evidence suggests otherwise.
So they miss opportunities or hold on to losers too long.
Exactly. That leads to missed opportunities or holding on to losing assets. They might also trade more frequently, racking up costs based on those, potentially flawed initial judgments.
Wow. Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. This bias even shapes how we engage with information on social media.
Oh, definitely. Research in social networking has shown confirmation bias influences how believable we find articles. And even our choices about whether to read, like, comment, and share something, we're far more likely to interact with content that aligns with our existing worldview.
Creating those echo chambers we hear so much about.
Exactly. It just reinforces itself.
So our social media feeds can become these self-reinforcing loops of agreement, strengthening our biases without us even realizing it. Now, this isn't just an online thing, is it? It can have serious implications in high-stakes professional fields, too.
Absolutely. Serious implications. Take the legal field, for instance.
Okay.
Once legal professionals involved in criminal proceedings develop a strong belief in a suspect's guilt, they might unconsciously engage in what's been called guilt-confirming investigation.
Guilt-confirming.
Yeah, it creates a kind of tunnel vision. They focus on evidence that supports their initial hypothesis and potentially overlook or downplay evidence that might point to other possibilities.
That's a sobering thought, that the very process of seeking justice could be unintentionally skewed by a pre-existing belief.
It is. And studies have even indicated that a judge's initial decision to detain a suspect can actually trigger confirmation bias later on.
How so?
It subtly influences their later evaluation of that person's guilt. They might inadvertently look for and interpret subsequent information in a way that justifies their initial decision to detain.
Wow. Okay, so for you listening right now, consider this. How might confirmation bias be influencing how you consume information online? What about decisions where you already have a strong gut feeling? Are you unintentionally seeking out information that just confirms what you already believe? Something to think about. Now let's move on to our second influential bias. Negative bias or negativity bias. What's the key idea there?
Okay, negative bias. In essence, it's our tendency to give more weight and attention to negative cues and information compared to positive or neutral stuff.
Right.
Think of it as our brain's built-in threat detection system being perpetually on higher alert for the bad stuff.
So that saying bad news travels fast seems to have a real cognitive basis then.
It really does. We just seem to register and remember the negative things more easily.
How does this manifest in the online world, particularly on, say, opinion platforms?
Well, negative bias has been specifically looked at in the context of online opinion platforms. Researchers have examined how negative information impacts our perceptions and decisions in those environments.
Okay, can you give us some examples of what the research has found?
Sure. One study identified a negative correlation between what they called triggered essential reviewing.
Triggered essential reviewing. What's that?
It's basically where a negative experience motivates someone to scrutinize reviews more carefully afterwards.
Ah, okay.
And they found a negative correlation between that and the actual ratings of those reviews they then looked at. This suggests that if we've had a bad experience ourselves, it can make us more critical of even seemingly positive feedback we encounter later.
So our own bad experience colors how we see other reviews.
Exactly. It's like our own negative experience makes us less trusting, perhaps.
Interesting. Any other examples?
Yeah, another piece of research highlighted a negative relationship between how much a review's rating deviates negatively from a product's average rating and how helpful people perceive that review to be.
Okay, break that down a bit.
Right. In other words, a significantly negative review, like a one-star bomb, tends to grab our attention more and be seen as more informative or helpful than a significantly positive one, like a glowing 5-star review, even if both offer similar levels of detail.
So the negative outlier just stands out more.
Our brains seem to prioritize it, yeah.
That definitely resonates with reading online reviews.
Yeah.
It often feels like those 1-star complaints really stick in your mind more than a whole string of 5-star raves.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So for you, the listener, think about this.
Yeah.
Why might that single negative comment about a service stand out more to you than several positive ones you've also read? That's the power of negative bias at work. All right, let's dive into our third key bias. Status quo bias. What's the main principle here?
Status quo bias. This is our fundamental preference for the way things currently are. We just tend to resist change.
Okay.
Even when the potential benefits of switching might outweigh the drawbacks, it's that feeling of sticking with what's familiar and comfortable, you know? Even if there might be a better option out there.
It's like inertia for our decision-making. We tend to stick with the default, with what we already know.
Precisely. Inertia is a good word for it.
What are some of the underlying reasons for this bias?
Well, several factors contribute. Plain inertia, it's often just easier to maintain the current course, right?
Less effort.
Yeah. Sunk costs play a role. We've already invested time, effort, or maybe resources in the existing situation. Mm-hmm. And then there are the perceived transition costs, the effort, time, and potential risks involved in actually making a change.
Ah, the hassle factor.
Exactly. Even if the potential upside of switching is significant, the perceived hassle of making the change can really hold us back.
And how has this been observed in the online world, according to our sources?
Well, status quo bias has been examined in the context of adopting new online tools, specifically things like collaboration and file sharing platforms. Research has indicated that both sunk costs, like the investment in learning and using the old tools, and the perceived transition costs associated with adopting and learning new platforms significantly contribute to inertia. They make individuals and organizations pretty resistant to switching.
So even if a new platform offers better features and could ultimately be more efficient, the familiarity and past investment in the old one can keep us kind of locked in.
Precisely. And this isn't limited to just business tools. Studies on smartphone users have shown a positive link between what they call cognitive lock-in.
Cognitive lock-in.
Yeah, feeling deeply integrated into a particular ecosystem like Apple or Android.
Gotcha.
There's a link between that and inertia, making them less inclined to switch to a different brand or operating system, even if other options might better suit their evolving needs.
That makes total sense. Once you're heavily invested in a particular phone's apps and features, it can feel like a massive undertaking to switch everything over.
It really can. And status quo bias has also been noted in other online environments too, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been observed in knowledge-sharing platforms and even online health service platforms. It highlights our general tendency to just stick with familiar options, even across really diverse digital contexts.
Right.
So for our listener, think about your own digital habits.
Yeah.
Have you ever stuck with a particular app, website, or maybe an online service simply because it's what you're used to, even if a potentially better alternative exists? That resistance to change is likely the status quo bias in action. Okay, so we've looked at these three key biases individually. Now, how does their impact differ when we're facing really high-stakes decisions compared to lower-stakes ones?
Yeah, that's a really critical point. The potential consequences of biased thinking can be dramatically more significant when the stakes are high.
Right.
Think about critical decisions in areas like medicine, law, or strategic business choices, where the outcomes have a really substantial impact.
Okay, let's explore those fields, starting with medicine. How can these biases manifest in medical decisions with serious consequences?
Well, in medicine, we see several biases potentially influencing critical choices. Availability bias, for instance.
Availability bias. Remind us.
That's where we overestimate the importance of information that's easily recalled. So it could lead a parent to refuse vaccination for their child after encountering, say, one compelling but ultimately isolated media report linking vaccines to autism.
Even though the science says otherwise.
Exactly. Despite overwhelming scientific consensus to the contrary, the vividness of that single negative story disproportionately influences their high-stakes health decision.
That's a powerful illustration of how easily recalled but maybe statistically insignificant information can sway a really important health choice.
It is. Another example is omission bias.
Omission bias.
Yeah, where inaction feels safer than action, even if it's not. A patient at high risk of ischemic stroke might refuse to take the blood thinner warfarin due to an exaggerated fear of causing a hemorrhagic stroke, even though the risk of not taking warfarin and having the ischemic stroke is significantly higher. They're biased towards inaction, omission, even when action would be medically beneficial.
So the fear of actively doing something that might cause harm outweighs the risk of inaction, even when inaction is actually the riskier path.
Exactly. And research using those hypothetical clinical scenarios, vignette studies they call them, has shown that availability bias can indeed impact diagnostic accuracy among medical residents. If they've recently encountered a rare condition, they might be more inclined to diagnose it in a new patient, even if the symptoms don't perfectly align.
Just because it's fresh in their mind.
Exactly. The recent memory makes that diagnosis more available in their minds.
It's like the recency of information makes it seem more important or likely than it actually is.
Precisely. And a broader review of research in this area has linked several cognitive biases, including overconfidence in one's diagnostic abilities, anchoring on an initial piece of information, and availability bias to both diagnostic errors and mistakes in treatment.
So it's not just diagnosis.
No. When medical professionals are overly confident or fixated on early information or unduly influenced by recent or memorable cases, it can unfortunately lead to suboptimal patient care.
That's a really sobering thought. Now, let's consider the legal field. How do cognitive biases play out in high-stakes legal decisions?
Well, in law, anchoring effects can significantly sway sentencing decisions.
Anchoring. The first piece of info having too much weight.
Right. Even if a prosecutor's initial sentencing recommendation is based on weak grounds or is even somewhat arbitrary, studies suggest that judges' final sentencing decisions tend to be influenced by that initial anchor. The first number presented can have a surprisingly strong pull.
So a number, even if it's not well-founded, can subtly guide their judgment.
It certainly appears so. And as we discussed earlier with confirmation bias.
Right, the tunnel vision.
Exactly. That can lead to what's often called tunnel vision in criminal investigations. Once investigators develop a strong belief in a suspect's guilt, they may subconsciously focus their efforts on gathering evidence that supports that belief.
And ignore other stuff.
Potentially overlooking or dismissing exculpatory evidence or alternative lines of inquiry. Yeah.
Again, the focus narrows, and the possibility of being wrong just gets sidelined.
Furthermore, hindsight bias, the tendency to look back at an event and believe it was more predictable than it actually was.
The I knew it all along effect.
Right. That can potentially affect how judges assess negligence. Knowing the negative outcome of a situation might unconsciously color their judgment of whether the actions taken beforehand were reasonable.
Even if those actions seem perfectly reasonable at the time.
Exactly. It's like judging past decisions with the unfair advantage of knowing the future.
Okay. Now, what about management and business? How do these biases impact strategic, high-stakes business decisions?
Well, in the business world, hindsight bias can definitely distort evaluations of past strategic decisions. A failed project might seem obvious in retrospect.
Yeah, always does.
Leading to undue criticism of the decision-makers who were operating with far less complete information at the time. It's easy to say, I told you so, after the fact.
Exactly. And CEO overconfidence seems to be a big one, too.
Oh, yes. It's been linked to several potentially risky behaviors. Research indicates that overly confident CEOs tend to make less accurate predictions about the stock market, for example. They also tend to overestimate their control over their company's performance, and they're more prone to pursuing mergers and acquisitions that ultimately don't create value. Maybe they destroy it.
Why? Because they think they can make anything work.
Possibly. Their belief in their own abilities might lead them to take on excessive risks or, say, overpay for acquisitions.
That's a significant concern.
Definitely. And overconfidence isn't exclusive to CEOs. It can also affect investors.
Right, you mentioned that with the return gap earlier.
Exactly. It can lead to excessive trading and ultimately poor financial returns due to transaction costs and poorly timed decisions. They might overestimate their ability to outperform the market and just trade too frequently as a result.
Okay. So, across these high-stakes domains, medicine, law, business, the impact of these unconscious biases can be really profound.
Absolutely.
Potentially leading to misdiagnoses, unjust legal outcomes, flawed strategic choices, with significant real-world consequences. Now, you mentioned contrasting this with lower-stakes decisions. How do biases show up there?
Well, in lower stakes decisions, the impact of biases might be less critical in the short term, but it's still definitely present.
Okay.
For example, choosing a restaurant based on a single, vivid, positive review a friend recently shared, that's availability bias at play again.
Right. Easy to remember that one recommendation.
Your decision is being disproportionately influenced by a readily recalled anecdote, even if it's not the most representative sample of the restaurant's overall quality.
So even something as seemingly simple as where to grab dinner can be influenced by these biases.
Exactly. And while the immediate consequences might not be severe, being aware of these biases can lead to more rational and ultimately better outcomes, even in these seemingly minor decisions over time.
So it adds up.
It's about making consistently better choices, I think, even when the stakes seem low.
Okay, so understanding these biases is clearly valuable. How can this knowledge be a useful tool specifically for business leaders and those in leadership roles?
Oh, hugely valuable. For leaders, being aware of the potential for, say, confirmation bias within their teams can foster more open and productive discussion.
How so?
Well, it can encourage a greater willingness to genuinely consider diverse perspectives, which is absolutely crucial for effective strategic planning and problem solving.
Right.
If leaders recognize that team members might be unconsciously favoring information that confirms their initial ideas, they can actively encourage the exploration of dissenting viewpoints and, challenge underlying assumptions.
So it's about creating a team culture where constructive disagreement is actually welcomed and actively sought out.
Precisely. That's key. Similarly, understanding negativity bias can help leaders avoid overreacting to negative feedback or minor setbacks.
Good point.
By being conscious of our inherent tendency to weigh negative information more heavily, leaders can strive for a more balanced assessment of risks and opportunities. It prevents them from being unduly influenced by isolated negative signals.
It's about maintaining perspective and not letting the negative disproportionately overshadow the positive or the potential.
Right. Spot on. And being mindful of status quo bias.
Sticking with the old ways.
Yeah. Being mindful of that can encourage leaders to proactively consider necessary changes and prevent their organizations from becoming complacent or stagnant simply because of a preference for the familiar.
Right.
They can actively question whether current practices are truly the most effective or if there are more innovative and beneficial paths forward.
It's about overcoming that natural resistance to change and embracing necessary evolution.
Exactly. And the research we've discussed also touches on how online platforms themselves could potentially be designed with an awareness of these cognitive biases in mind.
Oh, interesting.
This could potentially help users become more conscious of their own biases and make more informed decisions within those digital environments.
That's an interesting thought. Can technology actually help us become more aware of our own cognitive blind spots?
It's certainly a promising avenue. For instance, interfaces could perhaps be designed to prompt users to consider alternative viewpoints.
Like a little nudge.
Yeah, or to highlight instances where they might be disproportionately relying on easily accessible but potentially unrepresentative information. There's also the potential for refining recommendation systems to provide more objective and less biased information, broadening the perspectives users are exposed to.
So the goal is to subtly guide us towards more rational decision-making processes. Now, these biases seem pretty deeply ingrained. Is there any good news? What does the research suggest about practical ways to mitigate their influence?
Well, while these biases are indeed a fundamental part of how our brains work, research does offer several encouraging strategies for mitigation.
Okay, good.
As we just touched upon, simply raising awareness is a significant first step. Just educating individuals about these biases and how they operate can empower them to be more mindful and vigilant in their own decision-making.
Knowing is half the battle.
Something like that. Recognizing the potential for bias is the first step towards counteracting it.
So just understanding them can be a powerful tool in itself.
Absolutely. And there's also a body of research on specific debiasing training interventions.
Debiasing training.
Yeah. Studies have shown that targeted training programs can lead to measurable improvements in decision-making by equipping individuals with specific techniques to counteract particular biases. It's like mental exercises to build resistance against these tendencies.
So we can actually train our brains to be less susceptible to these biases to some extent.
To a certain extent, yes. For example, a key technique to combat confirmation bias is to actively seek out and genuinely consider multiple perspectives.
Okay.
And to deliberately look for disconfirming evidence information that challenges your existing beliefs. This forces you to move beyond simply seeking out validation for your initial ideas.
It's about actively playing devil's advocate with yourself, even when it's uncomfortable.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. Implementing structured decision-making processes can also be very helpful.
Like checklists or frameworks.
Exactly. These processes encourage a more systematic and objective evaluation of information and alternatives. They reduce our reliance on gut feelings and potentially biased mental shortcuts. Think of it as building in checks and balances for your decision-making.
So having a clear framework or a set of steps to follow when making important decisions.
Mm-hmm. And a specific technique that has shown promise in mitigating confirmation bias in particular is considering the opposite.
Considering the opposite.
Yeah. When you're evaluating a belief or a potential course of action, actively try to imagine why it might be wrong, why your initial thought might be incorrect. This simple act can help to weaken the grip of confirmation bias and open you up to alternative possibilities.
That's a really interesting and seemingly straightforward technique.
And it can be surprisingly effective. It's also important to remember that research in this field is constantly evolving.
Right. It's not static.
No. Scientists are continuously working to develop more effective and context-specific debiasing strategies. There's really no one-size-fits-all solution, and the effectiveness of different techniques can vary depending on the specific bias and the particular context of the decision.
It sounds like an ongoing process of learning and refining how we think and make choices. Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive into the world of cognitive biases.
A fascinating area.
Definitely. Let's quickly recap the key takeaways before we wrap up.
Sure. We've explored 3 really influential biases. Confirmation bias, our tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Right. Negative bias, the greater impact negative information has on us. And status quo bias, our preference for keeping things as they are.
And we've seen how these biases can influence both the everyday decisions we make and the really high-stakes ones in critical fields like medicine, law, and business.
Often with significant real-world consequences.
Yeah.
Crucially, we also discussed how understanding these biases can be a powerful tool, particularly for leaders.
Right, enabling them to foster more open-minded teams and make more balanced and informed assessments.
Exactly. And finally, we highlighted research-backed strategies for mitigating these biases, emphasizing the importance of self-awareness, actively seeking out disconfirming evidence, and maybe implementing structured decision-making processes.
Okay. So for you, our listener, here's a final thought to consider. Think about a recent important decision you had to make. Reflect on whether any of these biases, confirmation, negative, or status quo, might have unconsciously played a role in your thinking.
Yeah, take a moment and consider what small, concrete steps you could take in the future to make more de-biased decisions. It's a continuous process of learning and growth, right? And even a little bit of awareness can make a real difference. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.